Hello everyone and welcome back to the Yellow Dog 3D Tips blog. My name's Joe Dart and I work for Glued Films in Manchester. Today we're going to be having a look at some of the basic principles behind matte painting. We're going to be creating something that looks a little bit like this. Here's a little breakdown to show you the layers which go into it and the 3D geometry we're going to be projecting onto. So there's the final shot. So today we're going to be using a combination of software, Photoshop to layer all the images up and create the composition. We're going to be using Maya to create geometry which the images are going to be projected onto, and then everything's going to be tied up together in Nuke. So here are all the images which I've sourced from Google. We've got sky, we've got a fog element, we've got various mountains and a nice foreground element to add a bit of depth, and our main mountain which we're going to be projecting. I'll supply all these images in a zip file, so I'm just creating a 4K project file in Photoshop. That's 3840 by 2160. When you're putting together your matte painting, you're going to want to layer it from back to front, so you're going to want to start out with the sky and then the background mountains, but really it's all about planning your composition before you jump into it. I'm going to be creating a composition which I've created before, so it's all been worked out. So I'm just going to drag in one of my mountains. I'll just roughly position it where I think looks okay. So there we go. You can use whatever method you want to cut out your image. In this case I'm going to use the pen tool. That's just because it usually gives you a really nice edge. You can fix any problems that you made previously. So yeah, here we go. I'm just going to zoom in a little bit. Oh, I need to rasterize the layer as well before I can really edit it, because I dragged it in as a smart object. So rasterizing and just going around the edge with the Bezier curve, trying to get it as close as possible. I'm just going to cut here and I'll come back when I've cut around the whole thing. Okay, here we go. I'm just going to put the finishing touches on it. Once I've cut around it all, just go around the outside of the borders to get a clean cutout. I right click and make selection. I'm not going to feather it here. I'm just going to press Ctrl J to dupe that to a new layer. I'll get the selection. If I control click on the little image in the layers panel and go to select refine edge, here's where I'm going to add a little bit of smoothing and feathering just to clean up that edge. This will obviously help the composition. The better the edge, the better everything's going to work. So now we've got the new selection, we can press Ctrl J again and that will dupe our new selection to a new layer. So now we've got a nice tidy edge, but obviously our sky looks totally wrong. So I've just made the sky editable by rasterizing it. I brought up the levels panel on the sky by pressing Ctrl L, and I'm just matching the brightness of the sky to sort of a wintry look. Also, as a general rule of thumb, things further away in the background of a matte painting are slightly lighter, less contrasty, and also slightly less saturated. So I've just brought the brightness up on the back mountain just to create the illusion that it's further away. So I'm going to start bringing in some more images and layering this up. This image I found I think would be ideal for the really far away background mountains. Just going to roughly position this, and in this case we've actually got a quite contrasted edge around the mountain and the sky, so I'm just going to use the quick selection tool here. This is a really rough and inaccurate way of cutting something out, but in this case I think it'll be okay. I'm just going to press Alt and click just to bring some of the edge detail back. It looks like it actually worked pretty well. I forgot to rasterize the layer to make it editable, and I'm just deleting that sky, and you can see there is a little bit residual information left behind, so I'm just going to delete that off just using a quick selection here. I'm going to Control click again and refine the edge, bring the smooth and feather up, and obviously you can see it's not turned out too badly. Just going to press Ctrl J to duplicate that selection to a new layer, move that behind our previous mountain, and the further away things are, the more faded they become due to sort of atmospheric gases. It's actually called atmospheric perspective if you want to Google that. but I'm just bringing the levels up on that. I'm going to press Ctrl U and also bring the saturation panel up and just desaturate it a little bit. Just doing this all by eye, it's not really a science at this stage. Just going to brighten it up a little bit, make it look a little bit more faded, and it seems to look okay to me at the moment. So using the exact same processes we've just been through, I've gone through and layered more things up. I've added fog elements between every few layers. Here's the fog element. I'll supply this as well. It doesn't have any transparency, so I've just put it as a 45% transparency in Photoshop, which seemed to sort of look the best. So I'll just go through the rest of the layers now. Yeah, laying them up. Here's a few more foreground layers. Another fog layer. Here's the main mounting that we're going to be building geometry for. Fog layer, and here's our foreground element. That is just cropped out from here. It can be quite tricky to crop out because of all the leaves and things like that. But you don't have to be too accurate with the crop on that because it'll have depth of field and motion blur on it as well. So we do actually need to start saving out all of these layers as separate files. So just create a new folder, got elements, whatever you need, and every one of them has got to be saved out with transparency. So I like to use a TIFF file and just make sure the save transparency checkbox is ticked with no compression also, and just go through and do this for every layer, making sure only that layer is ticked on. TIFF files, make sure you label them appropriately, otherwise it will become very difficult later on. So I'm just going to skip forward. I would say make sure you save out a main comp just with the whole thing in for reference later on. It's really going to help you out. So here are my final elements. Everything's cut out, everything's got its correct transparency. I also didn't bother saving out the fog element 3 times because we can just comp this in a nuke later and add that transparency later on. So I've just jumped over to Maya and I'm creating a new scene. You can actually use any 3D program to do this, really. It's just a matter of preference. So the first thing I'm going to do is create a new camera and look through that camera and just set up the grid sort of like this. And I'm going to set up an image plane now, or a background if you're using Cinema 4D. And I'm just going to browse through to that main comp that we just saved out. So here we go. Set that up now, and now we're just roughly aligning the ground plane to where you would imagine it would be. This doesn't have to be 100% accurate, it's just to help us when we're adding objects into the scene. So that's looking okay to me now, and I'm going to start by creating a cube. This cube is going to represent our main foreground mountain. Just positioning it really roughly, doesn't really matter about the perspective or scale of it at the moment, because we're going to jump back into our camera view now and start to align it very roughly. So I've just rotated the cube, I'm just matching up the edges of it with the mountain. So looking at the shaded view, we can see it's coming along. It's quite hard to imagine what's going to go on at the moment. So just going to extrude these edges down, and I'm just matching that to the far end of the mountain. As you can see, that alignment. We can just carry on like this, so on and so forth. I'm going to rotate and move this to match the uppermost ridge of the mountain, as you can see. And I'm going to grab this far edge and match it to the contours of the mountain. The overall aim is just to get a rough piece of geometry which just roughly matches the shape of the mountain. So you can achieve this in any way you want. I usually find that just starting out with a box primitive and extruding the faces like this works the best for me, but obviously you can use any method that you're the most familiar with. So yeah, just working on the geometry, shaping it as best as I can. I'm just going to select these front faces and start to build the perspective towards the camera. So it's obviously getting quite hard to see what I'm doing here. Should go to the perspective mode, pull our geometry in a little bit. You will start to realise that it gets quite difficult to see what you're doing if you're working between the camera view and the perspective view. You start to run out of space. So as soon as that starts happening, I usually go to a split view. So I'll have my perspective view on one side and my camera view on the other. So yep, just shaping that top ridge. I'm just going to go to title save just so that I can zoom out a little bit and see what I'm doing a bit easier. But I'm just matching the top piece of geometry to the top ridge of the mountain, and it doesn't have to be perfect. Like I said earlier, it can really be extremely rough, because all that we really need is a rough shape to project our images onto. So I'm just going to go to the split view now. It's getting too difficult to see what I'm doing. This one can be my camera, this one can be perspective. Yep, so now it's much easier to see what I'm doing. I can just shape that geometry. I'm just going to speed this process up a little bit just for the sake of the video. We're just carrying on the exact same way which I've just explained, extruding faces and shaping it roughly to the shape of the mountain. At this point we're only just building in the front mountain geometry. We can work on all the other ones separately. The ones in the background don't really have to be 3D objects, they can just be planes or cards inside of Nuke, because you won't really notice any perspective difference on them. So here is the final piece of geometry that we're going to be using for the front mountain. It just only has to roughly match the contours of the mountain. You also don't really have to worry about the edges overlapping the mountain slightly, because Nuke projects out all of our images with transparency, so it takes care of the edges for us really. Something I forgot to mention earlier was that it's very important to make sure that you've locked your camera off. In terms of the attributes, everything should be locked as soon as you've set it up, because if this moves you'll find it pretty much impossible to put it back to the same point. So just make sure you lock off your projection camera as soon as you set it up. So I've just carried on in exactly the same way, creating geometry for all the different mountains except for the very far away ones, which don't really require it. I've not created any for the foreground element either, because I figured it was going to be covered in motion blur and depth of field, so I mean you could add it if you wanted to, but in this case I'm not going to. So that's what it looks like in perspective view. Looks a bit nothingy, looks like a bit of a mess, but as long as everything aligns roughly with the images, you should be fine. Something I did when I was modelling some of the background mountains was I set up the image plane as the corresponding mountain. I just found this was way easier to do. Obviously you can see the edge doesn't actually align properly, but Nuke will project out that transparency and it will look pretty much perfect. So I find that just makes it a little bit easier to see what you're doing, instead of trying to model it from the main comp. So now we need to export our camera and our piece of geometry into Nuke. To do that, I'm just going to open the outliner. It's a good idea to label your geometry, just because obviously if you've got a more complex scene than this, it will make it much easier to keep track of where you're up to. So I've just labelled that one main mountain, but in this case it's not really vital because we've only got two pieces of geometry on the camera. So I'm going to select that geometry and go to export selection, and a file format which Nuke will read perfectly is the FBX format. However, it cannot just be a plain FBX. You have to go down to the FBX file format options, make sure the type is set to binary and the version is set to FBX 2010. I found this format works perfectly. I think it might be the only type of FBX that Nuke can read perfectly. You can export everything from your scene as that, including your camera. So I'm just going to go through and do that for everything. So just jumping over to Nuke now once I've saved out everything, and what we need to do is bring in a camera node straight off and go to File, Read from File in the node properties, and select the the camera FBX file that we just exported. As you can see now we have a camera in the scene that is in the exact same position as the Maya camera. We need two read geo nodes, and this is going to bring in our geometry. We can select our FBX files for each piece of geometry. I'm just going to copy that path so that I don't have to type it again. As you can see, that's perfectly aligned. I'm going to get a new read geo node, paste it in, just change this to main mountain, just for speed. So there we go, I've got both my pieces of geometry in, I've got my camera perfectly aligned. We're now ready to start projecting out our images. So I'll just neaten up these nodes a little bit. I'm going to bring in a scene node. You obviously need one of these every time you're working with 3D and Nuke, and just plug in the outputs from our existing node into the scene node. I'm going to add a scanline render node so we can actually get an image out of our 3D scene. So you plug the camera tab into the camera, obviously, the scene into the scene, and now we can look through this. and you don't see anything, and that's because we have no images being projected onto them. Something I should have mentioned earlier, and I should have done straight at the beginning, was set up our working scale. So we're working at 4K, so I'm just going to set up a new template which is 3840 by 2160. So this is obviously the scale of all our images, and it's a 16:9 format. Oh, just need to label that quickly. I think, yeah, there we go. So I'm just going to neaten up my workspace a little bit, make it a little bit easier to work with. Obviously we've got some crossed over node cables here. I find it easy just to separate them off by pressing Control, add in these dividers. Just makes it a lot easier to see what you're looking at. So to start projecting our geometry, we're going to need these Project 3D nodes. You plug the camera tab into the camera. I'm just going to duplicate that, plug this one into the camera as well. And now we can plug our image tab coming from our Regio straight into this Project 3D. And this is going to mean that the image which is being textured onto that geometry is going to be a projection from our camera. So I'll just drag in our first piece, which is the main mountain, and I'm going to drag in the other corresponding image to the geometry which I've modelled. I'll just give you a preview of what they look like through just the viewer. So now I can plug the corresponding image into the corresponding Project 3D node. So there's one, there's the other, and if we press tab and look through our 3D mode, you'll see something pretty clever's happened. It's projecting out those images straight onto the geometry. As you can see, it's taking care of the edges perfectly. We're not going to have to worry about that. And this is exactly what we wanted to happen. And these two mountains are going to be the sort of foundations of our whole map painting. So as you can see, I've just dragged in the rest of the elements which we cut out in Photoshop into here. And just aligning them. I'm just going to copy these Project 3D nodes. Just copy and paste in them, one underneath each element, plug the camera in for each of them. Just doing that really roughly now. We can always neaten up things afterwards. Once we've got that, we can plug in the image for each of them. There's no geometry underneath each of these because the only geometry we're going to use is a basic piece of nuke geometry. So for the sky, I always use a sphere. That's just because I think it sort of makes sense. If you've got a moving camera, you're not going to want a flat sky. The skies are obviously spherical. So I've got my sphere in, but it's obviously far too small. So just using the scale options in the node attributes, we can start to scale that up. Far too small still. As you can see though, the projection is working. So I'll stick that up 10 times what I just had it, which is 100. The sky's in the correct place now. Maybe it's a bit too small, we can fix that later though, once we've got the rest of the projections in. So I'm going to start adding in a card for each of the other elements. This is a really far away background mountain. This can just be projected onto a simple card. I doubt anyone would ever notice that this is just flat. This seems to be the way that it's done in a lot of productions. There's no point in wasting time modelling things that you would never notice, have no perspective on them. So I'm just going to scale this card up and position it right at the back. It needs to be the furthest away, not as far away as the sky though, obviously. So this is looking okay now. In fact, sorry, it's not quite at the back. I'm going to put that there. Just looking at things, the sky definitely needs to be scaled up a lot more because it wouldn't be that close to the mountain. So I'm just going to plug my image into that card. As you can see, it's actually starting to project that image onto it with transparency, so there's no need to worry about how large that card is. It's only you're only going to see the parts of it with the image on because of the alpha channel we saved out with the TIFF file. So now I'm just going to copy and paste that card for all the different elements. It's fine to do this because you won't see the surplus edges of the card because of the transparency. We can just reposition these cards in 3D space. So just eyeballing the distances of what you think might be right. So as you can see, there's a mountain which is slightly closer to us. I'll show you that through the renderer. That's working really well. I'm just going to do the same for each of the other elements. Oh, I just accidentally dragged in the main comp image we saved out of Photoshop, but no worries, we can just delete that out. Here's the foreground element, so I'm just going to position this foreground card by double clicking it, bringing up the transform handles, taking it right close to the camera in front of everything. So this is just the foreground tree, just to add a little bit of depth. That's looking okay to me. I'm going to plug the image into it, plug it into the scene. As you can see, there we go, we've got every element we need. It's just time to add in some fog elements now. So here is my fog element. I'm just going to drag it straight in, copy and paste the project 3D node, plug it into the card, image into image, and finally bring a card in by copying and pasting it. I'm going to just position the fog where I think would be appropriate. I'm sort of cheating and just using the same fog element 3 times, so I'm just going to get 3 cards and plug the same image into it. A professional matte painting, you would obviously add a lot more of dynamic detail than this. This is just for demonstration purposes. So just positioning these cards where I think the fog should be, moving them back in 3D space. So now I can plug in our fog elements into these cards, just like so, and then each card goes into the scene node. And the problem here is that we don't have any transparency on this fog image, so just looking at that in 3D, you're going to be obscuring the back images. So to add some blending options, we can just put a merge straight after our fog element and bring the mix down to a suitable value. Again, it's just a case of seeing what looks right in your scene. You can see that there is transparency now on there. I quite like a subtle amount of fog, something that you don't notice too obviously, but it's definitely there. Things that sell the effect of a matte painting a lot are dynamic elements, so maybe a video element of some fog. Things like that just really sell the effect. So now we need to make an animated camera, and we can do that by first unplugging our projection camera from the scene. We don't want to change this at all, and we can just duplicate that by copying and pasting it, and we can just pipe that into the scene instead of the original camera. We can also plug our camera tab from our scanline renderer into our new camera, and just to keep things neat, we're going to label the old camera projection camera, and our new camera is going to be called animated camera or animation camera, whichever you'd prefer. It just makes it easier to see what we're doing when we're in our node view. So in the camera tab of our animated camera node, we need to untick read from file, and we can just go through and set a key on the first frame for all the translate and rotate boxes. I'm going to go to the end frame now, and I'm just going to slightly tweak all of these values just by highlighting one of the decimal points and just scrolling my mouse wheel. So I'm just going to speed this process up, but basically what I'm doing is putting the camera in a nice final position where it shows off some of the parallax of the shot, some of the perspective, and everything's framed quite nicely. Once you've set a key on all these boxes, everything's going to automatically keyframe, so you don't need to set another key. And here's the camera move that I've just created. You can see there's quite a lot of perspective in the shot, everything moves nicely. I'll just switch to my 3D view and just show you what's going on. So we've really just got a slight animation on the camera. It's just moving through all the different layers that we've created, and it's a really nice effect. Like, a lot of people might not even realise that that's not a video. So once you've got the base of this, there's lots of additional effects that you can play with. I like to add a little bit of motion blur after the scanline renderer, just to sell the shot a little bit more. I'm in proxy mode at the moment, just so that things refresh a little bit faster, but here you go, that's the motion blur on and off. Just blurs that edge off nicely. You won't really notice it in the background very much, but it really helps on the foreground elements. Just before I render it out, I'm just going to up the shutter samples to 15. Just gives you a nicer blur. It will take longer to render like this, but it does look a lot better. So now we can just write out our final image sequence. So I'm just going to navigate to a suitable folder. It's time to just name our image sequence, so I'm just going to call mine matte painting dot ###, which is the frame padding, which tells it it's going to be an image sequence, .tga. I'm going to change the compression to none and click render, and that's not going to work because I'm in proxy mode. Just turn that off, and I'll just pause it calculating that frame because I know it's right, and I'll click render again and that will work. And there we have it, that's the end of this tutorial. That's all there is to it really. Obviously we've just done a very basic example. but we've covered a lot of the key techniques which you're going to need to create more advanced matte paintings. So here's the final thing again. Thanks for tuning in, and there is going to be much more content in the future, so stay tuned. Thank you.